Alexander Downer was the foreign minister throughout the Howard government. He was at home in Adelaide when he got a phone call about the terrorist attacks, and he recalls that he knew it was a defining moment in history. Alexander Downer joins me live now from London. Alexander Downer, what do you think the legacy has been of September the 11th?
Well, I think there are three things to reflect on. The first is in terms of Islamic terrorism, which clearly was an enormous threat, not to the overthrow of our civilization, but to the stability of our societies, which, without it being countered, would have put us under constant siege and caused the loss of many lives in the United States, of course, but possibly even in our own country. Well, if you take all that into account, over the last 10 years, we've been very successful. The United States, above all's primary objective was to stop there being any further attacks on American soil. And it's an amazing thing, the extent to which they've succeeded. And I think from Australia's point of view, not to threatened to the extent, of course, America was, nevertheless, our agencies, our intelligence agencies, police, and so the list goes on, have done an extraordinary job in making sure that Australia was safe from terrorist attacks on our territory, though of course not in Bali.
So do you think that Al-Qaeda now, without Osama bin Laden, indeed without many of his top lieutenants, is actually still a threat?
Well, I do. I think in certain circumstances it's a threat, but it's important to put that into some perspective. It doesn't any longer have the global networking capabilities and coordination that it had back at the time of 9/11. That has been pretty much destroyed. Of course, in Afghanistan, where its headquarters were, but in many other parts of the world also. But that's not to say there can't be opportunistic attacks by Al-Qaeda associates or Al-Qaeda itself based on activities of local cells, which are obviously very dangerous, and so you can't say it's gone away. In terms of Al-Qaeda's operations itself on the ground, they've obviously been wiped out in Afghanistan, their capacity to operate in most other countries has been wiped out, but they're still active in a couple of countries, Somalia, which is still largely ungovernable, and Yemen, which is in a state of civil upheaval now. So they're still around, but they have been, to use the term the Americans like to use, very substantially degraded and the risk reduced but not eliminated.
In Afghanistan, the Taliban was so quickly toppled. Could you ever have imagined that 10 years later Australian troops would actually still be there?
I could, yeah. I mean, it depends, you see, what the mission is. The initial mission in Afghanistan was just to destroy Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda bases there. And since the Taliban was providing them with protection, the Taliban regime had to be overthrown. That all happened. Then there became mission creep. Well, you know, having done that, we need to promote a new democratic regime in a country that's never really known democratic regimes. So there were elections and President Karzai and his team were elected. But then, you know, they were under siege and had difficulties and weren't able to build up an army in a country which is 70% illiterate. So we had to fix that problem as well. So there's been a lot of mission creep. And finally, a withdrawal from Afghanistan will be possible when there's a political settlement, which, dare I say it, includes a negotiation with at least the moderate elements of the Taliban, not from a position of scurrying out, but from a position of strength where we say we'll stay until there is a political settlement here. But once that's done, I think it really will be time to go. We can't stay there forever.
Well, let's look at Iraq, where Australian troops were also involved. Do you think it's time there to declare coalition efforts there a success?
Yes, they've obviously been a success in net terms, but it was handled very badly in the period immediately after the overthrow of the Saddam Hussein regime and the fall of Baghdad, as it's often termed. The coordination and the management by the Americans was chaotic in that period immediately after. They hadn't done the right kind of planning. I appreciate all of that. So the Iraq invasion, occupation and liberation is not an incident in history without criticism, but on the other hand it did lead to the end of a terrible Arab tyrant and was the beginning, of course, of a chain of events that's led to what today we call the Arab Spring, the gradual reform of the Arab world, which was always something at the very heart of what gave Al-Qaeda, which wasn't particularly active, of course, in Iraq, but through the Arab world, it gave it its momentum. Dictatorships, tyrannies, opposition suppressed, jailed, beaten up, shot. The only real opposition in the Arab world came from the extremist Islamists, and so people who didn't like the dictatorships kind of gravitated to these Islamists because at least they were providing opposition. Well, largely those tyrants have started to fall, the first being Saddam Hussein, and it's a long process. This will take a lot of time, but the Iraq War, yes, it was the right thing to do at the time. The implementation could have been a lot better. But the outcome was certainly desirable.
I want to ask you about Pakistan. It's got a highly conflicted role in this fight against terrorism. It is a US ally, but it's also been accused, of course, of supporting Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. What's your assessment about the status of Pakistan and the role that it's playing?
Well, I don't think Pakistan has ever particularly supported Al-Qaeda, by the way, but you've got to remember, and it's a complicated story to explain in a short media interview, but Pakistan was the founder of the Taliban. Basically, what Pakistan did was set up Islamist organizations, in particular the Taliban, the Mujahideen, to fight the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And of course, they did that for strategic reasons, quite apart from other reasons. So the Taliban was their creation. Second thing to say about Pakistan is it, of course, is an Islamic country, the first country ever to be created as an Islamic country. And the one thing it doesn't want is to see India's influence extend, including into Afghanistan. So it has India to its east. It doesn't want India to its west as well, or Indian influence to its west. So it has an interest in keeping these Islamist movements going, and that's where they become conflicted with the Western objective of just destroying the Taliban.
Well, finally, Alexander Downer, I wanted to ask you about the relationship between Australia and the United States. Of course, the ANZUS Treaty was invoked in the wake of the September the 11th attacks. Can you envisage a time when perhaps Australia's ties to the United States become even closer with a greater American military presence here, for example?
No, I don't. Well, I can't say what will happen in the future, but that wouldn't necessarily make our ties even closer. I think this was a moment between September 2001, up until perhaps the demise of the Bush administration, when our relationship with the United States in a lot of ways was probably as intimate as it's ever been in history. The Prime Minister, John Howard, and President Bush had a famously very close personal relationship. I also had really close personal relationships with people at the top of the administration there. So we worked together in common cause. I mean, one thing I think this interview should not conclude without me saying is that we achieved an extraordinary thing in terms of countering Islamic extremists in Southeast Asia, particularly in Indonesia. It's not said too often, but we didn't do that just with the Indonesians, the federal police, ASIS and so on, working with the Indonesians. We did it with the Americans and to some extent the British as well. And the cooperation between our countries in order to defeat extremist Islamists in Southeast Asia, which was a bit of a life and death issue for Australians, as we know from the 2 Bali bombings, was an extraordinary example of how closely our countries cooperated through that period.
Certainly a positive legacy from September the 11th. Alexander Downer, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
It's a great pleasure.